So, my name is Tom Perera, and I'm a retired professor of neuroscience, and I specialized in research on the coding strategies of the human brain, sort of figuring out how the brain codes and decodes messages. And for almost 40 years, my enigmamuseum.com has been the only organization in the world that hunts for, researches, restores, and provides fully restored and working Enigma cipher machines to museums, historians, and to collectors. Enigma Museum found and restored the Enigma that appears in The Imitation Game and the one that appears in Snowden. I've also been very interested in spy radio communications. I was able to buy a lot of spy radios at the end of World War II and play with them, put them on the ham bands, and that sparked my interest. So I'm going to tell you tonight about spy radio communications and a little about the Enigma, and end up with some stories about CIA bugs. So here we go. Whenever a country is occupied, troops come into that country and take it over. And it's a very scary, very scary thing for the people in the country. And among the things that the troops typically do is they go up into people's houses and up into people's apartments and take over their living quarters. And they throw all their furniture out on the street. You can see a typical dump of furniture out here, which is being trucked away. So the people in an occupied country are not very happy, and they fall into three categories. The citizens fall into three categories. One category says, oh, wow, these guys really are powerful. I better collaborate with them. I'm going to tell them whatever I know about what's going on in my country. I'm going to spy for them, and they become the collaborators. And the second group of interest is the do-nothings. And the do-nothings do nothing, as you could well expect. And there are a lot of do-nothings. The third group is what interests us, and that is the people who form the resistance. And these are the patriots. These are the people who fight against the occupying troops. And they get involved in active fighting and spying on the enemy activities in their country, but they also activate radio networks, and they receive news from the opposition, the people who are trying to get rid of the people who occupied their country, and they also send out intelligence. The problem is that the resistance are typically not trained radio operators. So the trained radio operators are trained in, typically in this case, Britain, and they become very active and proficient operators, and they're dropped by parachute into the occupied country. And then they set up these portable radio stations, which we call spy radio stations, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So let's get started. We start out with a typical group of partisans, resistance fighters. Here they are learning about guns. Look at the expression on this guy's face. Wow, he's saying, and looking at this machine gun. Am I actually going to get to fire that machine gun? And sure enough, there he is up there with a machine gun shooting at the enemy. So that's known as active fighting against the enemy. The resistance also placed bombs on the railroad tracks and any place where they thought it would do a lot of damage to the enemy, and they were very active with that. The major job of the resistance was spying, and spying involved very often taking photographs of enemy installations and enemy activities. You can see in this illustration a camera that is embedded within this woman's pocketbook. And it looks like she's looking into the pocket, but it's actually a Rolleiflex. And so she's looking right down into the camera viewfinder and aiming it at the thing she's taking a picture of. Here's another kind of spy camera built into a cigarette lighter, and the spy looks like he's lighting a cigarette, but he's actually taking a picture of an enemy military installation or activity. Some spies do very strange things. This guy is very annoyed by the fact that clothing rationing had been instituted. And so he decided he would protest clothing rationing by going without clothing. So this is one of the activities of the resistance. Clandestine radio receivers are the bread and butter of the resistance. They bring in information about what's going on and what the allies, the opposing forces want done in the occupied country. And they take many forms, but the critical thing about these radios is that they must be absolutely hidden and not found, because if you're found with one, you're instantly killed. So here's a typical spy radio receiver in a suitcase. And the resistance developed all kinds of strange places to put radios. Here's one in a telephone book, here's one in a furniture leg, and one in an electric iron. Look at down here, you see the telephone book, the furniture leg radio, and the radio inside the electric iron. See the two tubes in there? Quite a complex activity to do this. Phonographs were a favorite place to put radios. The phonograph on the left and the phonograph showing the internal radio on the right. Phonograph on the left down there, and phonograph showing the internal radio on the right. Here are some others. How about a Brownie camera and a thermos bottle? Open up the Brownie camera and you can see the radio tubes. Open up the thermos bottle, you can see the coils and the radio tubes. And here we have a rather strange clandestine radio. It's actually built into a dental appliance. You put this thing in your mouth and you can actually hear radio stations with it. There's a very strange physiological phenomenon whereby if you put audio signals into your mouth and the signals activate your saliva, it actually transfers into your auditory system. And it's a very, very odd system, but it actually works. I've tried it. You can take the speaker leads of a radio and put them in your mouth and you can hear what would be coming out of the speaker. I don't advise you try that because some speakers are active with high voltages on them. So don't get any smart ideas about trying that little trick. Here is a really peculiar radio. This is a little bit later in the spy radio game. The CIA actually made this radio, and the radio fits inside of a fake scrotum. And this allows you to undergo a body search and they won't find the radio. So it's really quite an absolutely amazing device. The most commonly used spy radio receiver was called the Sweetheart radio receiver. Has a receiver, tunable receiver, audio volume control over here, and a battery pack, and a set of earphones. And this was a very popular set. They were made by the tens of thousands in England and parachuted into the resistance in France and Norway, all over Europe. Here's a Sweetheart radio that's been hidden inside a clock. And here is a Sweetheart radio being listened to by some of the resistance fighters. The Germans also provided radios to their own people. And these radios allowed their people to listen to hear the Führer, den Führer. And they were allowed to use these radios. Matter of fact, they were made available to them very cheap. They were called the Volksempfänger, like a Volkswagen, which is a people's car. A Volksempfänger, the word empfänger means receiver, a people's radio receiver. And families were shown listening happily to the Führer's voice and the German music during the war. But every radio came with this little warning tag, which basically said, this radio is for listening to the Führer and for German music. If you listen to anything else, you're going to be dead. And they made this a very serious threat by occasionally transmitting tones on the BBC broadcast. And if a person was listening to the BBC broadcast and tones came out of the receiver, neighbors would sometimes hear this and turn them in. And so people were very afraid to listen to the BBC and other broadcasts. Clandestine spy radio operators that were parachuted in from England were also called pianists. Sort of think of a pianist operating a piano key and think of a radio operator operating a telegraph key. Again, the penalty is death, and many, 70% of the people who did this died during the war. Here's a training session for some radio operators where they learn the Morse code, they learn how to operate these clandestine radio sets. They also, in England, had extensive wardrobes of German officers' uniforms and all kinds of uniforms so they could parachute their spies into Germany and outfit them so they would fit into whatever area of Germany they were aimed for. The radio sets were packed very, very carefully. This is a B2 spy radio, but it's been packed in this incredibly flexible and soft packing, which is designed to allow it to survive being dropped from a parachute from an airplane. Here are the radio operators climbing into the airplane, getting ready to be para-dropped into the French countryside. And here they are after they've made it to the French countryside operating their spy radio. And the operators, the radio operators, look very normal. They always had to have an antenna. You can see the antenna wire going up here. And the favorite place to put an antenna was up the chimney of whatever house they were in because you couldn't see it from outside. So they'd run an antenna up the chimney and transmit for a while and then quickly take the antenna down. Here's another operator with 2 spy radios. Here's a very deadly looking radio operator with a spy radio. He looks somewhat familiar, but really some guy you don't want to meet in a dark alley. And here is a very, very famous and wonderful spy radio operator, codenamed Paulette. And she was parachuted into Normandy before the invasion at age 23. And here she is over here at age 23. And here's how she looks nowadays. She sent half-hour coded reports and then ran far away from her radio set, knowing that she would be found by direction-finding teams within 1.5 hours. So she really had to skedaddle out of there. Her activities were very important for the reporting of what was going on in these occupied countries. Here she is sending. She also every night would hide her radio in various places. One part of the radio, the receiver part, fit right into a vacuum cleaner. So unlikely that she would be caught with that. Here's another female radio operator sending Morse code with a telegraph key, a spy radio over here. And if there were no mains powers, no AC power, the power was often generated by a hand-operated generator, such as you see in the background. Messages were gotten to these spy radio operators in loaves of spoiled bread, so the Germans would not be tempted to look inside the bread. Here is a lady carrying a spy radio. They're very, very heavy, as we'll see why in a moment. And she is carrying it up a flight of stairs, trying to look innocent. It's a lot easier if you happen to have a bicycle. There's the spy radio on the back of the bicycle, much easier to transport it that way. And here are a couple of spies in the woods transmitting messages. Notice that this guy has a machine gun. This guy has a machine gun. This guy has a machine gun nearby. And here's another group with machine guns handy over here. And they are using a hand crank generator to make the electricity for their spy radio. Clandestine spy radio sets came in a number of different types, but by far the most frequently seen was the British designed and made B2 radio. These sets are outlined and described in a wonderful and very expensive book on clandestine radio written by Louis Mulesty, who is, by the way, a ham. It's the Bible of those of us who collect spy radios. Here's one version of the spy radio type A, British, made in Britain, and very popular among spies, and looks very innocent in its suitcase. Here's a parachutable version of it in a metal case, so to withstand the drop from a parachute, and it is known as a paraset. And here is the classic British B2 spy radio. It was designed initially by John Brown, G3. EUR. And we have here a receiver in the front, a transmitter in the back, and plug-in coils and plug-in crystals for those. And over here on the right is a multiple voltage power supply. And in back here, you find a telegraph key. Here's the schematic diagram of the transmitter. Very simple crystal oscillator over here, power amplifier over here, and out we go to the plug-in coils and out to the antenna. The receiver is tuned RF stage receiver, high gain amplifier, feeding the information out to the other stages of the radio. And this is the power supply. This is very interesting because the power supply worked on 6, 12, 24 volts DC and 110 and 220 volts AC. So it was a very neat power supply. Problem was this doggone transformer, multi-coil, multi-turn transformer was exceptionally heavy. And that made the entire set very heavy. And you couldn't walk around very easily with this thing unless you were pretty strong, because it would pull you over and literally pull you over to the side. And here you are trying to make it look as though you just have a suitcase full of clothing, but the thing's pulling you down. So it looks a little bit suspicious. Little bit of nomenclature for you. Mike Cresto, Mr. Mike, W1RC, gave a talk with me on spy radios, and he made this little chart. For World War II, radios that start with an SCR followed by a number are known as set complete radio, and that's transmit, receive, and power supply. BC is basic component. In late World War II, the PRC models came in, and that stands for portable radio communications. In the 1950s, we had TRC, tactical radio communication, GRC, ground radio communication, VRC, vehicle radio communication, SYNC-CAR, single channel ground and airborne radio system. And it got more complicated after that, but it's useful to have these abbreviations in mind. Here, for instance, is a PRC-1, very early suitcase portable radio. And here is a GRC, ground radio in a suitcase, the telegraph key over here, separate receiver and transmitter and power supply. And then you get into the really, really odd experimental radios. This is an experimental scuba radio. You wear the radio on your back along with your air tanks. You talk into your mask. I don't know what you do about an antenna, but I never flew, so I've never seen more than one of these. And here is another one. This is a doggy radio. It's not clear from any of the literature whether this allowed the trainer here to talk to the dog and give the dog directions by way of an earphone that you see strapped on the dog here, or whether the dog could talk to the trainer. No, I'm just kidding about that. Whether the dog could be given directions as to go and sniff around or bite somebody. So, but this is a sort of an evolution of the spy radio systems. I'm going to give you a little look in a secret Theta room. There's a network of spies that hid away in the back of one of these buildings in the Bergen, Norway seaport. A big seaport, lots of ships in World War II, and a lot of buildings over here that took care of the people in the ships. And if you look at these buildings, they're very long buildings. And this little spy headquarters was in the back. Here's the waterfront down here. And way in the back here, we see the Theta room. Named the Theta room because the code name for this group of spies was the Theta group. In order to get there, you had to walk down this incredibly long passageway. You had to find your way up this flight of stairs to the second floor. You had to find your way up this flight of stairs through this camouflaged cover door here to the third floor. And then you had to look around for a door. And there was no obvious door up there. But if you knew exactly what to do, this set of wooden boards became a door. And my wife is shown here holding the only way that you can open this door, which is to have a piece of metal wire and to connect this nail over here on the left to this nail over here on the right. And if you did that, it activated an electric motor. There's the left nail and the right nail contact, activated an electric motor, which was belt driven to pull the latch on the door and allow you to enter. If you, on the other hand, tried to break down the door, you would be blown up. there was in the same room a large box full of TNT, dynamite, and some batteries. So this was the bomb, which would blow you up if you tried to enter the room. Here's the room, and up in that cabinet is where the bomb is hidden. You can see a number of radio receivers here, a large transmitter with a big rheostat for adjusting the power, and all of the equipment that the well-equipped spy would need. Here we have the B2 radio up on a shelf. Here we know what that is, a sweetheart radio hidden in a cutout of a book. Here we have some guns in a drawer along with some money, hand grenades, and of course, very importantly, some surgical instruments in case any of the spies were injured in their activities. The most important part of this room, however, was a dark room where they developed and printed the pictures that they took, because their main job was to take photographs of the enemy installations and the enemy ships. And here's a picture of an German enemy ship that was taken by a Theta spy and transmitted to England, actually taken to England for analysis by the English. So that was a very important group. And of course, their major problem was direction finding, people that were looking for them. When they would transmit a signal, little trucks like this one would be rolling around in the street with complex direction finding antennas like the one you see on this truck here, trying to track them down. And it's interesting, the Theta group never got caught by direction finding. They kept their transmission short. They did get caught, however, by a German soldier who was inspecting the roof over the Theta room, and he fell through the roof into the Theta room and literally found himself in the middle of the spy headquarters. And although none of the spies were there, it gave away their location, and some of them were caught as a result. Happily, unfortunately perhaps, he did not blow himself up with a bomb. And but the room was discovered, and it's now a museum. If you ever get to Bergen, Norway, it's an absolute must. You've got to go see the Theta room. Here's some other direction finding vehicles. Sometimes they were inconspicuous, like this car, which had a hidden direction finding system inside the car. Less inconspicuous, direction finding truck. Sometimes these trucks had operators inside. And the idea is you rotate this antenna and you find the bearing, the magnetic bearing between your truck and the radio of the spy radio. And that helps you locate where the spy radio is. They also use the Feisler Storch, a very, very slow flying surveillance aircraft with a direction finding antenna on it to help find the location of these spies. Both of these techniques, the truck and the aircraft, could only locate spy radio installations within a few blocks within a city. And at that point, you had to get down on your feet and use a device like this suitcase hidden spy radio direction finder. And here you can see the direction finding receiver, the direction finding loop, the sense antenna inside the suitcase. And you can see that there are thumb controls that allow you to control the power and turn off the headset or the volume. And you wore a set of inconspicuous headphones when you were doing that. Here is a KGB, no, a German officer outfitted to find hidden radios. And he's actually carrying a hidden body-worn radio receiver. The antenna for this receiver is in his arms. And so when he moves his body, it actually changes the signal strength. And by turning his body so that his arms are pointing in line with this receiver, with an enemy transmitter, you get a null, and he could locate the antenna, the transmitter. If we undress him, we see that he actually is wearing this thing under his clothes, but it looks really inconspicuous until he opens up and shows us. This is a battery-operated tube-type receiver with the antenna in the arms. Very, very deadly, and it allowed the Germans to pinpoint an enemy radio transmitter within a very, very narrow range of options. His readout was a wristwatch that had been modified as a signal strength meter, so that the stronger the signal that was coming in, the more that red needle that you see there would move over to the right. And so he could look as though he was just quietly looking at his wristwatch, while at the same time he was very accurately pinpointing the location of the spy radio operator. To counter this, some clandestine operators used very, very rapid Morse code sending devices called burst encoders. And you can't send the Morse code very, very fast. The fastest you can send the letter A dot dash is about da, and that takes a while. But if you take this stylus here and you run it down the slot that says A here, very, very quickly, it makes a short contact and then a long contact, dit da, and sends the A extremely rapidly. So even if you didn't know Morse code, you could use this device and send these letters so fast that the radio intercept operators were actually unable to detect the message and unable to locate using the radio direction finding antennas. So that was one of the techniques that the spies used. They also used enciphered messages. And here we see a spy writing a message in code. And here it is, an actual transcribed message in code, 5-letter group, so they could be transmitted by radio to a receiving station, or they could also be embedded within a walnut shell and carried over to England in an inconspicuous form like this. German spy controllers often used Enigma machines to keep the messages to spies secret. The spies never used Enigma machines because they were too heavy and too cumbersome and too likely to be captured. But the controllers used Enigma machines to communicate all over Germany and talk about where their operators were. So they were really giving away the location of all of their spy radio operators by communicating using Enigma machines. And of course, the British were intercepting the Enigma signals and decoding the Enigma messages, and this revealed the actual location of the spy radio operator. So these radio operators were actually revealed by the Enigma messages. Here's one of them. He parachuted into England. His name was Tate, and he was a double agent. He was given the choice, as all of these guys were. You can have two choices. You can either be hung, or you can work for us, the British, and pretend that you haven't been captured, and you can send messages back to your people in Germany at our command. And he chose not to be hung, and he became a double agent, which meant he sent messages back to Germany. He was given a personal code wheel, which he used for encoding his own messages. Again, they didn't have Enigma machines, the spies didn't, but they sent messages back in coded form. Here's another guy. This guy set up a beautiful ham radio station right in the middle of New York City during the war, about 1942. A nice dog over here on the right, some typical ham receivers, a battery down under the shelf here. And here he is transmitting, and he was sending secret messages embedded in his inconsequential sounding ham radio conversations. And they got back to England, and he was found out because his controllers talked about him on the Enigma, and they located him. He was actually hidden in the top floor of this apartment building in New York City. That was his room up there. Here's a picture of him here on the left. He was a very active spy until he was caught. At the end of the war, the radios that had been confiscated from everybody, nobody was allowed to have a radio, as we've said, were finally given back. And you can see some lovely old radios being given back to people here. And that made them all very, very happy. So that's what I have to say about the spy radios. Now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about CIA bugs. Bugs are hidden microphones that allow you to listen in on what's going on inside a room. And this set of information, this talk really, was put together by very dear friends of mine, Paul Rubers and Mark Simons, and they run by far the very best website having to do with spy radios and crypto machines like Enigma machines, and their internet site is cryptomuseum.com. We start out with hidden microphones, and one of the most common hidden microphones that was used was a wristwatch with a microphone in it and a wire going to a tape recorder that a person kept in their pocket. So the wire would go up your sleeve to a tape recorder. This is a wired microphone. And here is a wireless microphone. This is a radio transmitter that is actually slipped inside the knot of a necktie. You can see the antenna here is curled around the person's neck. And the problem with this type of transmitting microphones is that they have to have a battery, and batteries wear out. So they are limited in their ability to function. Here's a CAT scan of a CIA microphone bug in a pen. And you can see the various components because the CAT scan reveals what is inside the pen. On the left, we have a battery. Here we have a little capsule microphone, typical condenser mic, a transistor, the transmitter in the middle here. And way over on the right, we have the loading coil and a little bit of an antenna stub. And this was good for short range transmissions and would pick up any audio near the pen and transmit it, but again, limited by the fact that the batteries had a fixed life. This is a Russian phone tap, and this device was sneaked into the basement of a person's home. It was designed to look just like a signal conditioning sensor. And it says on it, signal conditioning sensor. And that, of course, is meaningless. You don't need the signal conditioning the phone lines. But what it actually was a phone tap, and it tapped into the phone line, used a couple of condensers so it wouldn't load down the phone line, used an amplifier chip over here to increase the signal strength, and then it fed out the information to a transmitter or a direct wire to a tape recorder. Now, this was a technique installed in hundreds and hundreds of homes and basements in Russia during the Cold War. Here's a KGB bug, a very simple miniature transmitter of the 1960s, had a single transistor. You can see the transistor right in there. It was a free-running oscillator, and the crystal earpiece that you see here actually was a microphone, and it frequency modulated the signal in a tuned circuit. The problem with this was, first of all, it depended on batteries, and secondly, it was relatively easy to find. All you needed was a bug detector of some kind. Here's a very complex bug that was built into an IBM Selectric typewriter. It is way down in the workings of the typewriter, looking very innocent, but it's a very complex set of electronics using the electrical energy from the typewriter to keep the bug going, and any auditory signals in the vicinity would be rebroadcast by radio to rooms nearby where receivers might be picking up the information. So there were just huge numbers of bugs, and this table just shows some of the many, many kinds of hidden microphones or bugs that were used by these spy operators and spy operations. To detect the bugs, a device called a bug detector was used. And this is one of the simplest of the bug detectors. It has two antennas, a small one and a large one. As you can imagine, the large one for a lower frequency set of signals, the small one for a higher frequency. And over here, you can see the schematic diagram, the high band antenna and the low band antenna. And these both feed into just a simple diode. And the diode then is switched in depending on whether you are looking at high frequency signals or low frequency signals. The diode is switched into an amplifier, and the amplifier then amplifies the output and operates a meter on the front to indicate the relative signal strength of what you're listening to, or a set of earphones or a loudspeaker. And people could walk around with this device looking fairly innocent. This guy looks pretty innocent, I would say. Doesn't look like he's listening in for bugs, but if he does a little revealing act, suddenly you see his radio on his chest there and his earphones. So you can walk around fairly innocently and detect these signals in that way. Or you can use a signal detecting device. This is another receiver used during the Cold War for detecting spy radios. And you can see very obviously here, there's a loop antenna, and you just turn your body to look for a null or a peak in the signal strength using this type of device. The next step, of course, there's always this ongoing war of between people and between the spies and the people who are trying to detect them. One of the techniques that was used was to use jamming. And for jamming, an external radio source would produce a strong signal that would basically jam the radio transmitting bug in the center of, let's say, a room here. And since the signal was synchronized, you could null out the signal, and you could then detect the signal from the bug if you were operating the jamming transmitter. And of course, the jamming signal would completely obliterate the signal coming from the bug for anybody trying to detect the signal. So what do you do to counteract that? You develop a differential receiver. A differential receiver is an interesting concept in which you have two exactly balanced antennas. And if a signal comes into the left antenna and the right antenna simultaneously, that signal is canceled out. Here we see the detector down here with the right antenna A2, left antenna A1, and the jamming signal comes in, and if it reaches these two antennas exactly the same moment, that jamming signal is completely blocked out, a typical differential amplifier circuit, and that leaves you able to receive the bug signal. So very neat technology developed to overcome jamming technology. Another technique that was developed, if you're going to have bugs and all, why not have a real bug? And so the CIA in the 1970s started building these incredibly complex drones, which were electrically operated. They had a little battery in them. They had radio transmitter, and they had a microphone in the tail over here, and they would buzz these things through the room. So if you can't jam a signal, you run these little bugs through a room and pick up sounds, hopefully without anybody noticing and swatting at the bug. This was not very successful because it did make a little more noise while it was flying than was optimal. So in the 2017, the CIA got the idea of using a real dragonfly bug. And here you can see this poor little dragonfly over here with a complex radio system mounted on its back, little antenna, a microphone, a chip, and so on. And this poor little thing has to fly around a room and listen in to enemy discussions. This was fairly successful, surprisingly. It doesn't look like it would work, but it was fairly successful. And it shows you the ends that people will go to in order to overcome the various techniques that are designed to overcome jamming. The next step we need to talk about is the incredible coup in which the Russians gave a beautiful seal of the United States to the Americans when the Americans opened their embassy, the US embassy in Moscow. And in 1945, right at the end of the war, the Russians said, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you for helping us with World War II. We want to thank you so much. We've had this beautiful seal of the United States made for you." And the Americans put this up in the main room in their embassy. And inside the seal was a little single piece of wire and a very strange looking little round thing. And in 1952, It wasn't until 1952 that the CIA actually found this little thing inside the seal. And they didn't know what it was, because it certainly wasn't a hidden microphone or anything like that. And they were so embarrassed by this, I think, that the discovery was not publicly revealed until 1960. And this was a very strange device in here. It was a passive element, just a piece of wire, no electronic parts at all, and no batteries. How could it possibly be transmitting a signal to a receiver if there are no electronic parts, no batteries, and so on? So let's take a look at it. Here it is. Here's the actual device that they found. And it is, here you can see, a capacitive microphone. And the membrane of the microphone is here, and the other side of the capacitor is this metal plate here, and the metal plate is capacitively coupled to the antenna over here. So electrically, the schematic looks like this. The variable capacitor that you see here is the capacitive microphone. There's a little fixed capacitor here and a tuning coil over here, and then a series capacitor that allows you to tune the antenna to the appropriate frequency. The microphone diaphragm would vibrate back and forth. That would change the electrical characteristics of the so-called tuning post that you see here. And the coupling disc would couple the antenna to the tuning post. So a signal, an auditory signal coming in here would produce capacitive effects on the entire system, but that still doesn't explain how the signal got out of the room. And for that, we need to realize that the room was constantly being bombarded by high energy radio frequency signals. The radio frequency signals were causing the passive antenna element that we've seen to vibrate electronically, to oscillate. Let's say you put in 10 megacycles and this little wire is oscillating at 10 megacycles or megahertz. And then the receiver, an associated receiver, was able to detect the 10 megahertz signal from this oscillating wire and receive it. And they were able to cancel out the initial energy supplying RF signal and detect the actual audio. Here you see the microphone, and the in this case was a mechanical amplifier that modulated the wire with audio frequencies. Here's a little closer look at the circuit and the circuit as it later evolved. We have an antenna element, which is just a passive piece of wire, and a diode in the middle, sort of a diode with a dipole with a diode in the middle. The diode allowed the exciting voltage to produce a voltage that could then be used to operate an audio amplifier. And so here's a microphone with an audio amplifier being operated by the voltage coming off this diode, and the audio amplifier is feeding the audio signal into and causing the antenna element to oscillate at audio frequencies. A little finer detail over here, you have chokes to get rid of the RF, and a very simple microphone audio circuit down here amplifying the signal. So this technology was absolutely new and surprising and interesting to the KGB who had designed it. They kept designing better and better ones, and also very interesting to our people who were taking apart the Great Seal and trying to figure out what was going on. The CIA finally figured it all out, and they started building these devices of their own. And they decided that they really wanted to bug the Russian embassy. Since the Russians had bugged their embassy, they wanted to bug the Russian embassy, which is located over here in The Hague in the Netherlands. And so they did that by, first of all, getting to a desk that they knew was going to be installed in the Russian embassy. And they took apart the desk, and specifically the leg of one corner of the desk, and they inserted their passive element microphone into a hole in the leg of the desk. They weren't stupid, so they actually drilled similar holes in all the other legs of the desk and inserted wires in there. So if the Russians used a metal locator to check it out, it would just look like all of the legs were the same. And if they decided to take apart one leg, chances were that they wouldn't take apart the leg that had the microphone in it. So here is a later evolution of the same technology that we've been talking about. You have to irradiate this thing with high energy RF and detect the signal that it is radiating. Microphone up here on the top, and they were able to listen in to any and all conversations that were going on inside the room. Now, here is the setup. On the left over here, you see the area where they're going to try and detect the signals. And 125 meters away on the right, you see the Russian embassy. Now that's a long distance, and therefore you need a great deal of power in order to do that. And so in the top room of this building here on the left, they set up a 10 kilowatt RF generator. That is 500 watt transmitter with an antenna that multiplied the power of the transmitter up to 10 kilowatts. So they were blasting the Russian embassy with 10 kilowatts of energy. You may perhaps remember back to a little earlier this year, last year, when some of our diplomats in the Cuban embassy were complaining of headaches and various kinds of strange ailments and neurological problems. It is highly likely that they were actually being bombarded by a transmitter, perhaps even more powerful than this one, which was used back in 1958 to bug the Russian embassy. Anyway, transmitting from up here, up this flight of stairs, and the antenna was located pointing out this window at the Russian embassy. And they blasted the Russian embassy with a very, very high power signal, and they were able to actually receive the audio from the desk in the Russian embassy. So that's the technology that was being used and is still being used, and it allows people to bug rooms without actually having to have direct connections to any kind of microphone, without having to worry about batteries or anything of that type. So that's my story, and I'm Tom Perera, again, enigmamuseum.com. And if you have any questions, visit our website, enigmamuseum.com.